This is part 8 in a video series on the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And over the past several videos, we've established the historical evidence for 5 minimal facts. 1. That Jesus died by crucifixion. 2. That his tomb was found empty by a group of his women followers the following Sunday morning. 3. That the disciples both claimed and believed that Jesus appeared to them alive after his death. 4. That a church persecutor named Saul of Tarsus became a Christian after he was convinced that the risen Jesus appeared to him. And 5. That Jesus' skeptical brother, James, although being a skeptic before Jesus died, became a believer in him afterwards, because he believed he saw Jesus appear to him. And also 6. The origins of the disciples' belief going against the cultural norms. And in the previous video, we looked at several naturalistic theories that try to account for these facts. Any good historical hypothesis is going to have to account for all 6 of the minimal facts. I went over 7 theories in the previous video, but because the video ended up being 40 minutes long, and I wanted to devote a good amount of time to a couple of the theories that I'm going to be looking at today, I decided to make this part of the series a 2-parter. So, with that out of the way, let's go on to the other naturalistic theories. Let's see if they fare any better than the previous 7 we looked at in the previous video. Theory 8, the legend theory, embellishment version. Could the resurrection have been a legend that developed over time? No. Why? Well, because as we saw in a previous video in this series, now let's see, was it introduction, fact 1, fact 2, fact 3? It was part 4 in this series that we saw in that video that we can trace the claims of the resurrection to the lips of the original disciples. In Paul's letters, he said that he had access to the original disciples and had fellowshiped with them. And I'm sure Peter told Paul whether or not he had seen Jesus when he visited them in Galatians 1. And he certainly told Paul that in Galatians 2. As in Galatians 2, we see that the whole purpose for Paul visiting the apostles in Jerusalem in that second visit was to determine if the other apostles were preaching the same gospel that he was. He says that I set before them the gospel I preached to make sure that I wasn't running and had not been running the race in vain. And then Paul goes on to say that the apostles added nothing to him, but instead recognized that he had been gifted, he had been chosen by God to be an apostle to the Gentiles, just as Peter had been chosen to be an apostle to the Jews. Peter was chosen to be an apostle to the Jews, Paul was chosen to be an apostle to the Gentiles. So they sent them his blessing. Now, if Paul was preaching that Jesus rose from the dead, and the apostles weren't, if the disciples weren't, then that would not be the case. In Galatians 2, the disciples would have said, "No, Paul, we're not preaching that Jesus rose from the dead. You're preaching a false gospel. You need to change. You need to repent." But no, instead, they gave him his blessing. So Paul tells us that the disciples were preaching that Jesus rose from the dead. So it couldn't have been a legend that got embellished over time. We get right back to the lips of the disciples through Paul. And, of course, the creedal tradition that Paul cites in 1 Corinthians 15 dates to within 5 years after the death of Jesus. See part 4 of this series to see the evidence and the arguments for why I say that. And it's very likely that he got the creed from Peter and James when he visited them 3 years after his conversion. Also, see part 4 of this video series to see the arguments for why I think that, and why most scholars think that. This is well within the lifetimes, 5 years, of the 12 disciples who could have corrected this oral tradition if he really hadn't appeared to them. But if Paul got the tradition from Peter and James, they wouldn't have corrected him anyway, because that's where it originated. Moreover, The early church fathers, Tertullian and Irenaeus, independently attest that the church fathers Polycarp and Clement were students of the Apostle John, and that they knew several other apostles as well. This is significant because Polycarp and Clement say that the original disciples were claiming that Jesus rose from the dead. Since Polycarp and Clement knew and fellowshipped with Jesus' disciples, they would certainly be in the position to know what the disciples believed. So Paul, Polycarp, and Clement are three independent sources which say that the disciples were preaching that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them. And these three sources had direct contact with the original disciples. And with 7 independent sources that attest to their martyrdom, we can conclude that they didn't just merely claim that Jesus appeared to them, they really believed it. The fact that we have all of these independent and early sources which attest to their martyrdom shows that they didn't just claim it, they believed it. Why? Well, because liars make poor martyrs. People will die for a lie that they think is true, but no one will die for a lie that if they're consciously aware of the fact that it's a lie. We saw earlier in this series that the 1 Corinthians 15 Creed dates to within 5 years after the crucifixion. A.N. Sherwin-White of Oxford University did a study of the rates at which legend develops in the ancient world, and he discovered that 2 generations of time weren't enough for legend to build up and eliminate a core of historical truth. But we don't have 2 generations of time here. We don't even have an entire decade. We only have 5 years. As the popular Christian apologist Lee Strobel has said, this is like a news flash from ancient history. Between the event and the source that records the event, 5 years is a news flash. Let's look at theory number 9, the copycat theory. I've got to give Gary Habermas credit for the name of this theory, because Jesus is just a copy of pagan deities. It's a bit of a mouthful just to say the name of a theory. Copycat theory is just so much better. Now, I have to say that this theory, in terms of popularity, has an extreme contrast between academia and lay circles. If you'll remember from the previous video, scholars like Bart Ehrman, Gerhard Ludemann, E.P. Sanders, a lot of skeptical atheist, agnostic, non-Christian scholars, they're really on board with the hallucination theory. But lay people atheists, the ones you'll encounter on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, etc., they hold to an entirely different theory. But no scholar does. Scholars just dismiss this out of hand. This theory is extremely popular among internet infidels, but hardly any historian who studies ancient Palestinian history gives it any merit. It was popular among scholars in the 19th century, but it was thoroughly discredited and abandoned at the turn of the 20th. As I like to say, it was killed by scholarship, but its ghost lives on in the realm of atheistic blogs. Now, the theory says that Jesus, the story of Jesus as we find it in the New Testament, was just essentially plagiarized from various stories of dying and rising gods in pagan religions that predate Christianity. Sometimes, in a conversation with a Christian, the skeptic will say something like, "I'm going to describe someone, and I want you to tell me who it is. This man was born on December 25th. To a virgin. A star in the east signaled his birth. He had 12 disciples. He walked on water. He was killed, but then he rose from the dead 3 days later." And the Christian goes, "You're obviously talking about Jesus." And the skeptic goes, No, I'm not. I'm talking about the tale of Horus, who predated Jesus. You see, Christians just took the story of Horus and put a new spin on it. In fact, Horus is not the only example. There are many examples of pagan gods who match the description of Jesus. You, Mr. Christian, don't believe any of these. So why would you put much stock in the story of Jesus? Can't you just see that the story of Jesus is just the myth that took hold? And often in these discussions, the Christians are rattled. They have never heard any of this before, and it does a major dent in their faith. Many atheists don't just argue from this that Jesus' miracles and resurrection were plagiarized from these pagan deities, but they infer that these similarities disprove that Jesus of Nazareth even existed as a historical figure. There are several problems with this theory, several. That's why I want to devote so much time. I want to devote so much time to it because, number one, this theory has probably the most problems with it out of all of them. And secondly, as far as the people who are going to be watching this video is concerned, most of the skeptics are probably going to be clinging to this one. The first problem is that you still have to explain the minimal facts. In one sense, this argument is merely a red herring. Now, if you don't know what the red herring fallacy is, the red herring fallacy occurs when someone brings up an argument that is irrelevant in the debate at hand. When you think about it, whether there are stories predating Jesus doesn't really tell us anything as to whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. As we saw in part 2 of this video series, Jesus' death by crucifixion is multiply attested in 9 independent sources. 4 of those accounts are secular in nature, i.e. Josephus, Tacitus, Marabar Serapion, Lucian of Samosata. 1 of them is Jewish, i.e. the Talmud. And 4 of them are from the New Testament, i.e. the Gospel of Mark, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, the Gospel of John, and the Apostle Paul's epistles. On the basis of the criterion of multiple attestation alone, we can have the utmost certainty that a man named Jesus existed and died on a Roman cross at the command of Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea, during the reign of Tiberius Caesar, at the request of the Jewish Sanhedrin. It is statistically impossible for 9 independent sources to all make up the same lie and then treat it as though it were a historical event. 9 independent sources. You expect me to believe that 9 independent sources all made up the same lie? The whole of the first century was in on making up this person named Jesus and saying he died at the hands of Pontius Pilate via Roman crucifixion? Come on. Moreover, we have enemy attestation to the crucifixion of Jesus, as Tacitus and Lucian of Samosata were mocking Christianity in the very same context in which they affirm the historicity of Jesus and his death on the cross. If the story of Jesus' death were a myth, Tacitus and Lucian would have gladly pointed that out. Instead, Lucian said in a nutshell, those silly Christians, the God they worshipped is a crucified criminal. And Tacitus said, quote, Christus, the founder of the name, Christian, suffered the extreme penalty at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, during the reign of Tiberius. End quote. They are hostile sources who affirm the historicity of Jesus' existence and death by Roman crucifixion. Moreover, there are many details in the gospel accounts about Jesus' death that the disciples or the early church just wouldn't make up, such as Jesus crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Even though in the same book, Jesus repeatedly predicted his death and gave the reason for why he had to die. Not to mention that it's awkward for God to cry out to himself and seemingly have no faith in him. In John's Gospel, the women are the only ones who have the guts to stay with Jesus during his final hours, while all of the men are in hiding because of fear of the religious leaders. Additionally, crucifixion wasn't just an excruciatingly painful way to die, it was a humiliating way to die. Crucifixion victims were sometimes crucified fully nude, and even in cases in which they weren't, they were crucified in their undergarments. Imagine how you'd feel if you were strung up in town square wearing nothing but your Fruit of the Loom briefs. Why would the early church make up a story that demeans their God in such a way? If they were going to make up a fake story about the death of Jesus, why not have him die by stoning, a much more dignified death? The criterion of embarrassment applies to the gospel crucifixion accounts in 3 different ways. The first minimal fact passes so many of the criteria of authenticity that it's just futile to try to deny its historicity. Well, what about the second minimal fact, the empty tomb? Again, pointing to parallels between dying and rising pagan gods, no matter how strikingly similar they may be, doesn't explain the empty tomb. Like the crucifixion, the empty tomb is established on multiple lines of historical evidence. The criterion of embarrassment applies to the empty tomb accounts because women were second-class citizens back then whose testimony was so worthless that, according to Flavius Josephus, they weren't even permitted to serve as witnesses in a court of law. Given that women's testimony was so lowly regarded, it's highly unlikely that the disciples or the early church, whoever wrote the Gospels, would depict them as being the chief witnesses to the empty tomb. For to do that would be to put words in the mouths of witnesses who would not be believed. Just make men the first witnesses to the empty tomb, and then you can avoid Celsus's charge that the first witness to the empty tomb and the resurrection was a half-frantic woman. If the gospel authors were making up the empty tomb story, they would have made male disciples like Peter or John discover the empty tomb so they wouldn't have to deal with critics like Celsus. The fact that it is women who are the chief witnesses to the empty tomb instead of men is best explained by the fact that that's just how it went down. They just recorded it the way it happened, even though it was, for them, an awkward and embarrassing fact. So the criterion of embarrassment gives us good reason to believe the historicity of the empty tomb narratives. Pointing to supposed parallels to Jesus and dying and rising gods does nothing to refute this argument. It does nothing to refute the historicity of the empty tomb, and it certainly does nothing to explain it. The empty tomb also meets the criterion of multiple attestation, for it is recorded by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And as I said in the video about the evidence for the empty tomb, we have good reasons to believe that Matthew and Luke are not getting their material from Mark in this case, because Matthew and Luke both include material about the empty tomb narratives that you just can't get in Mark. They're not there. It is statistically impossible for 5 independent sources, which it would be 5 if you include the 1 Corinthians 15 creed. It's not explicitly mentioned in the creed, but it is implied in the phrase, died, was buried, and was raised. But even if you leave out the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, we have 4 sources, and it is statistically impossible for 4 independent sources to all make up the same lie. So by the criterion of multiple attestation, the empty tomb is a historical fact. Further, regardless of whether or not the disciples were merely plagiarizing pagan deity stories, the Jewish leadership would have gladly gotten Jesus' body out of the tomb, showed it to everyone, and the hoax would have been squashed before it gained any traction. The fact that Christianity is still alive today is a strong indicator that the enemies did not get Jesus' corpse out of the tomb and parade it down the street for all to see, crushing the resurrection movement from the get-go. Why didn't the enemies of Christianity go down to the tomb and pluck Jesus' body out to show it to everyone? Well, maybe the reason they didn't do that was because there was no corpse to be exhumed. The tomb was empty. Moreover, the historical evidence that Jesus' disciples both claimed to see the risen Jesus and that they really believed it is not refuted or addressed by pointing to similarities between Jesus and pagan gods. In part 4 of this video series, we saw that we can trace the claims of the resurrection to the lips of the original disciples. In Paul's letters, he says that he had access to the original disciples and had fellowshiped with them. In Galatians 2, Paul says that his purpose in meeting the apostles was to make sure that they were preaching the same message. Paul says they were in Galatians chapter 2, verse 6. In 1 Corinthians 15:11, Paul essentially says it doesn't matter whether you talk to the 12 disciples or him, you're going to receive the same message because they're preaching the same message. Moreover, the creedal tradition, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verses 3 and following, dates to within 5 years after the death of Jesus. This is well within the lifetimes of the 12 disciples who could have corrected this oral tradition if he hadn't appeared to them. Moreover, the early church fathers Tertullian and Irenaeus attest that the church fathers Polycarp and Clement were students of the Apostle John, and that they knew several other apostles as well. This is significant because Polycarp and Clement say that the original disciples were claiming that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them. Since they knew and fellowshipped with Jesus' 12 disciples, they would certainly be in the position to know what the disciples believed. With the 7 independent sources that attest to their martyrdom, we can conclude that they didn't just merely claim that Jesus appeared to them, they really believed it. They really believed that Jesus rose from the dead and appeared to them. Then we have the conversion of the 2 skeptics, Paul and James. If the story of Jesus' resurrection were just merely a plagiarized tale from the pagans, how on earth did these 2 skeptics get involved? What caused Paul to go from persecuting Christians, whom he believed were leading Jews away from worshiping the one true God, Yahweh, to being a Christian himself? Why is it that James didn't believe his brother was the Messiah until sometime after his brother's death? As I argued in the previous video, the best explanation is that they had experiences of seeing the risen Jesus. The major point I am trying to emphasize in rehashing the minimal facts and some of the historical evidence for them is this. You need to explain the experiences of the disciples, Paul and James, if you're going to adequately explain Christianity's origin. If you don't explain the disciples' experiences, if you don't explain Paul's conversion, and if you don't explain James's conversion, if you don't explain the empty tomb, you haven't explained Christianity's origin. The historical evidence that we've gone over in the past several videos establishes that the 5 minimal facts are indeed facts. And these facts are neither refuted nor explained by saying, look, the story of Jesus looks a lot like the story of Adonis, or look, the story of Jesus looks a lot like the story of Horus, or look, Jesus and Mithras are very similar. I don't care. Explain the empty tomb. Explain why the disciples believed they saw Jesus after his death. Explain what caused Paul and James to believe they saw Jesus alive after his death, or just shut up. Second problem with the copycat theory is that parallels between stories is no indication of non-historicity. Just because 2 stories may be a lot alike does not entail that one of them isn't historical. We have some strange examples in history of 2 very similar stories, but no one doubts their historicity. I'll give you 2 examples. One example is, a long time ago, there was an incredible tragedy that occurred. A huge passenger ship, which people said was unsinkable, on a cold night in the North Atlantic, about 200 miles off of Newfoundland, struck an iceberg and sank. Many people died because there weren't enough lifeboats. Now, you believe I'm talking about the Titanic, right? Nope. I'm talking about a ship called Titan in a novel written in 1898, 14 years before the wreck of the Titanic. The novel is called The Wreck of the Titan, and it's written by a person named Morgan Robertson. The parallels between the fiction, The Wreck of the Titan, and the historical event of the Titanic are really striking. However, I don't know of anyone who would argue that there never really was a ship called the Titanic that sank. If the novel, The Wreck of the Titan, doesn't disprove the historicity of the accounts of the Titanic, why would any similarities between Horus and Jesus, or Mithras and Jesus, or Dionysus and Jesus prove that the accounts of Jesus' miracles, death, and resurrection aren't historical? And as I pointed out in the previous section, Jesus' resurrection is well attested. On the other hand, the stories of Horus, Mithras, Attis, etc. have next to no historical evidence in their favor. And also, recently, on the Cerebral Faith Facebook page, I posted a satirical meme. And here it is. So, you think Evan Minton is a historical figure. That's me. I'm Evan Minton. Well, let's look at Michael Licona. Both Michael Licona and Evan Minton have ADD, attention deficit disorder. Michael Licona doubted Christianity was true, but he resolved those doubts because of apologetics. Evan Minton doubted Christianity was true, but resolved those doubts because of apologetics. Michael Licona doubted seriously on more than one occasion. It was multiple occasions. Evan Minton doubted seriously on more than one occasion. Michael Licona wrote a book arguing for the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. Evan Minton wrote a book arguing for the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. My Redeemer Lives, Evidence for the Resurrection of Jesus, available on Amazon.com in both paperback and Kindle. Michael Licona has brown hair. Evan Minton has brown hair. Michael Licona had his picture taken in front of a stained glass window. Evan Minton had his picture taken in front of a stained glass window. Well, according to the logic here, because there's so many similarities between Michael Licona and Evan Minton, and then of course Michael Licona preceded Evan Minton by decades, therefore Evan Minton is not a real historical figure. Any biography about Evan Minton is just plagiarized from Michael Licona. Obviously, this is silly. I obviously exist. I'm here talking to you. I have a lot in common with Licona here, but that doesn't mean that I don't exist and that my life story was just plagiarized from Licona. And Timothy Fox of Free Thinking Ministries has also brought up this same sort of reductio ad absurdum argument in his blog post, The Stratton Myth, which he published to freethinkingministries.com. Timothy Fox writes, "How well do you know Tim Stratton, founder and president of Free Thinking Ministries? Let me list some facts about Tim. Tim is a Christian apologist who blogs at Free Thinking Ministries. He enrolled in the Master of Arts in Christian Apologetics program at Biola University from 2012 to 2014. He graduated with highest honors on December 19th, 2014. He's heavily influenced by the works of Dr. William Lane Craig. He has a passion for theology, philosophy, and apologetics, and destroying naturalism. He was predestined to freely adhere to Molinism. He loves superheroes and Star Wars. He plays the bass guitar. He was born in the United States in the last quarter of the 20th century, married for nearly a decade, and has a son. Is bald, white, bearded, and has blue eyes. Practiced mixed martial arts." And then Fox goes on to say, "Here's the catch, though. I wasn't describing Tim Stratton," and by the way, I don't know if you can see the words of this blog post on the screen. Screen captures sometimes get kind of blurry when I export. But Fox goes on to say, "Here's the catch, though. I wasn't describing Tim Stratton. I was describing myself, Tim Fox. These are all facts that are true about me and are also allegedly true of Stratton. But what are the chances that all of these things are true of two people. There are two bald-headed, blue-eyed, bearded white guys named Tim who attended Biola University from 2012 to 2014 and graduated on the same exact day with the same exact degree. They like the same stuff, have the same passions, married with a son. I think there's only one rational conclusion. Tim Stratton is a lie. He does not exist. He is obviously a copycat version of me, Tim Fox. Stratton is a myth, a legend crafted to troll naturalists and Calvinists. And then Fox goes on to say, sound ridiculous? Of course it is, especially to the people who have known him his whole life. But this is exactly what Jesus mythicists argue. There are allegedly other gods, such as Horus and Mithras, that were used as a template to fabricate Jesus of Nazareth, the central figure of Christianity. You can go on to read the rest of his article himself, where he points out other problems with the copycat theory. But this is just to say that even if the skeptics are dead right in saying that there's a whole bunch of similarities between this pagan god and Jesus, that proves nothing. Nothing. It doesn't get you anywhere. And by the way, I share a lot of things in common with Tim Stratton. We're both Molinists. We're both really into Marvel superhero movies. We both have apologetic ministries. We both blog. We both spend a lot of time arguing with people on the internet. Let's see, what else? I guess I'm a copy of Tim Stratton as well. It's just really, really bad logic. Let's go on to the third problem with this argument, and that's that Jews were committed to an exclusive faith. Jews were adamantly committed to their religious beliefs and traditions and refused to blend their religious ideas and traditions with that of others, a view known as syncretism. Mystery religions were inclusive. They would adopt any doctrine or theological concept they wanted to. They were very loose. They didn't have a measure of orthodoxy. But Judaism and Christianity, on the other hand, were exclusive. In general, Jewish people adamantly resisted outside religious ideas, and this is most likely due to the fact that they had, by the time of the first century, learned by reading the Old Testament that God did not tolerate mingling with other nations. He did not put up with idolatry. In the Antiquities of the Jews, the Jewish historian Josephus talks about an event in which the Romans tried to force something on the Jews and how the Jews responded to it. Flavius Josephus writes, quote, "But now Pilate, the procurator of Judea, removed the army from Caesarea to Jerusalem to take their winter quarters there, in order to abolish the Jewish laws. So he introduced Caesar's effigies, which were upon the ensigns, and brought them into the city, whereas our law forbids us the very making of images, on which account the former procurators were wont to make their entry into the city with such ensigns as had not those ornaments. Pilate was the first who brought those images to Jerusalem and set them up there, which was done without the knowledge of the people, because it was done in the nighttime. But as soon as they knew it, they came in multitudes to Caesarea and interceded with Pilate many days that he would remove the images. And when he did not grant their requests, because it would tend to the injury of Caesar, while yet they persevered in their request, on the 6th day he ordered his soldiers to have their weapons privately, while he came and sat upon his judgment seat, which seat was so prepared in the open place of the city that it concealed the army that lay ahead to oppress them. And when the Jews petitioned him again, he gave a signal to the soldiers to encompass them round, and threatened that their punishment should be no less than immediate death, unless they would leave off disturbing him and go their ways home. But they threw themselves upon the ground and laid their necks bare, and said they would take their deaths very willingly, rather than the wisdom of their laws should be transgressed, upon which Pilate was deeply affected in their firm resolution to keep their laws inviolable, and presently commanded the images to be carried back from Jerusalem to Caesarea." End quote. It is undeniable that Christianity sprung up out of a thoroughly Jewish culture. The idea that a group of devout Jews would see ideas in pagan religions, and then they would be like, oh, hey, that looks like a pretty good idea. Let's do these things. That's incredibly implausible in light of what we know about ancient Jews. Okay, here's the fourth problem with the copycat theory, and that's that the similarities between Jesus and the pagan deities are very vague. One of the reasons, perhaps the main reason, why the copycat theory lost its standing among scholars is that the more they compared Jesus' story to the stories of these pagan gods, the more they found it implausible that any copying had been done. The similarities that were touted were very vague and stretched. The differences among the accounts were jarring and far outnumbered the vague similarities. Just as you would find a lot of dissimilarities if you read a full biography of Michael Licona and myself. Let's look at just a few examples. One example is that Dionysus is said to have died and risen again like Jesus. But when you examine the stories, you find that Dionysus wasn't miraculously raised from the dead by his deity father, but that his mother pieced him back together. Other stories say that Dionysus was killed by Zeus swallowing his heart, and his heart was made into a potion given to Semele. Does this sound like Jesus at all? Dionysus was born on December 25th, just like Jesus. That's plagiarism, right? I mean, well, first of all, I share a birthday with actor Zachary Quinto, but that doesn't mean that I don't exist. That doesn't mean that if biographies were written about our lives, that you could say, oh, Evan Minton is just a copy of Zachary Quinto. Secondly, the Bible never says that Jesus was born on December 25th. The date for Christmas was chosen by the Pope hundreds of years after Jesus was born. In fact, this is something I think everybody probably knows. December 25th is not a biblical date. Most scholars think Jesus was born in the summer. Michael Heiser from the Naked Bible podcast gives a very compelling case for Jesus being born on September 11th. I'll leave a link in the show notes below. Unless I forget, in which case I'll leave it in a pinned comment. It is said that Mithras was born of a virgin, just like Jesus. Newsflash, Mithras was born out of a rock! Now, I guess technically one could say that since rocks can't have sex, the rock was a virgin, and therefore you do have a virgin birth. But by that logic, Frosty the Snowman was born of a virgin, since I'm pretty sure that old soot hat wasn't getting any. This is ridiculous. The birth of Mithras was nothing like the birth of Jesus. Jesus was born of a human woman, not a rock. What about Horus? During his battle with Set, he lost an eye, but he never died. And since he never died, he couldn't have been resurrected. Death is a prerequisite to resurrection. That's why the first minimal fact that I defended is Jesus died by crucifixion in this series, because you gotta have a death before you have a resurrection. What about Osiris? Osiris was killed by his brother, chopped up into 14 pieces. The pieces were scattered all over Egypt. The goddess Isis retrieved all of those pieces, except for one, and put him back together again. Yeah, that looks a lot like the story of Jesus' death and resurrection, doesn't it? Moreover, Osiris wasn't really even resurrected, in the sense that the early church meant resurrection. He was brought back to life in a sense, but he was given the status of God as the god of the gloomy underworld. Now, these are just a few of the not-so similarities between Jesus and pagan gods. If you would like more information about how dissimilar Jesus is from these pagan gods, I advise you to go to Michael Jones's YouTube channel, Inspiring Philosophy. He's got several videos that tackle Jesus and each of these gods individually. Now, much more could be said on why the copycat theory is a failure to refute the historicity of Jesus' resurrection. And again, I recommend that you go check out Inspiring Philosophy's YouTube channel. Inspiring Philosophy. He's got a whole bunch of videos on this subject alone. This theory is just silly. It's complete and utter rubbish. For a variety of reasons. First, even if all of the claims of the mythicists were true, it would do nothing to refute the historical arguments for the 5 minimal facts. Secondly, simply noting parallels does nothing to account for the empty tomb and the postmortem appearances of Jesus. Secondly, if you're going to say that similarities in stories is a hallmark of myth, well then I need to just fade out of existence right now into the oblivion, because I have a lot in common with Michael Licona and Tim Stratton. I must not exist. Cogito ergo sum. Oh, well, I guess René Descartes was wrong. Thirdly, it's highly improbable that first-century Israelite Jews would have incorporated any elements from outside religions, given how exclusive they were. Fourthly, the similarities that are present are vague and strained. Now wait, let me back up and go back to that third point. Yes, the Jews were very syncretistic in their early periods. I mean, you see that in the Old Testament. I'm talking about first century Jews, first century Hellenized Jews living in Jerusalem from 4 BC to 100 AD. Now, the fourth point is that the similarities that are present are vague and strained. The differences far outbalance the similarities. Naturalistic theory number 10, the twin theory. This theory says that Jesus had an unknown identical twin brother who saw Jesus hanging on the cross one day and decided to prank the disciples by stealing the body, hiding it somewhere, and then appearing before the disciples telling them that he was the risen Lord. This theory is kind of silly. Aside from the blatant ad hoc nature of this hypothesis, it has several problems. For one thing, are we expected to believe that no one was smart enough to figure out that the person who appeared to the disciples, Paul and James, wasn't Jesus? The twin would not have known the disciples very well. As a result of that, he would not have been able to copy Jesus' mannerisms and personality. The disciples would have very likely have gotten suspicious. Hey, Jesus, are you okay? You're not acting like yourself. Moreover, the twin would not have been able to walk through walls, nor would the twin have been able to ascend to heaven. Now, we've run out of naturalistic theories, and we saw that they are all bad. Some of them are better than others as far as being able to explain some of the facts. Some of them can't explain any of the facts. The best ones can explain one, maybe two, if you grant it unlikely scenarios. But none of them explain all of them, and they all are plagued. So, what do we do? What's the best explanation of the facts? I think the best explanation is he is risen. He is risen indeed. Again, remember in the previous video, we talked about what the criteria are for a good historical hypothesis. And I'm going on C.P. McCullough's criteria that he puts forth in his book Justifying Historical Descriptions. Again, the criteria are as follows: explanatory scope, Explanatory power, plausibility, not being ad hoc or contrived, being in agreement with established beliefs, and outstripping its rival theories. The "he is risen" hypothesis passes every single one of these tests with flying colors, while the same cannot be said for all of the naturalistic theories we've looked at. Let's look at how the resurrection hypothesis meets these criteria. What explanatory scope? Well, it explains why the body of Jesus was not in his tomb. It explains why 500 people saw him on one time. It explains why the 12 disciples saw him on 2 different occasions. It explains why the church persecutor Saul of Tarsus saw him and converted and stopped being a persecutor. It explains the conversion of the skeptic James. Hey, if my brother claimed to be God and the Messiah, and then he died, and then he showed up again at my doorstep, I'd probably believe him too. It explains every single piece of data that requires an explanation. But the best of the naturalistic theories can only explain one of the minimal facts at most. And some, I've given orange check marks. If anybody was wondering what the orange check marks meant in the previous video, it meant, well, it could, it's possible. We can't completely rule out that it could explain this minimal fact, but it's not very likely. But if it just can't account for it at all, I gave it a red X. But if it could absolutely account for it, I gave it a green check mark. So just in case any of you guys were wondering. Explanatory power. It explains all of the facts. Plausibility. Given the background of Jesus' life and claims, which I haven't looked at in this video series, but I have in my written material, especially in my book, My Redeemer Lives, which I suggest you pick up for a more thorough treatment than even this YouTube series goes into. Given the religio-historical background, the resurrection is an authentication of Jesus' life and claims, his claim to be God, his claim to be the Messiah. If he had a 3-year ministry of miracle working, prophecy fulfilling, and grand claims, then the resurrection is not just some freak event that happened that just happened to some guy one day. What about not being ad hoc? Well, an ad hoc theory is ad hoc if it requires making quite a few other theories to save itself from being proven erroneous. The resurrection is not that kind of explanation. It only requires the subsequent declaration to be true, that it is possible that God exists. Because you have to have a miracle-working God in order for a miracle to occur. It is in accord with accepted beliefs. Now, I can hear, before anybody leaves a comment in the comment section saying, "People who die stay dead, stupid. Science has proven that dead people don't come back to life." That's not a valid objection, because the hypothesis is not that Jesus rose from the dead by natural means. It's that God raised Jesus from the dead via a miracle. This does not conflict with the conventional belief that people cannot and do not rise from the dead naturally. What about outstripping rival theories? Well, we've seen that none of the naturalistic hypotheses can adequately explain all of the data. But the resurrection hypothesis succeeds in criteria 1 through 4 above, and therefore it should be preferred. I'm sorry. The best explanation of the minimal facts is he is risen. Using abductive reasoning, I've come to the conclusion that Jesus' resurrection can account for the 6 minimal facts. What is abductive reasoning? Well, J. Warner Wallace explains it in this video I'm about to play.
You can tell how old this presentation is. Now, when we find somebody's dead in a room, we're not quite sure we have a criminal case yet, because there are more than one way. There's 4 ways to die. Only one of those ways is criminal. We got to figure out which of these 4 ways this guy died. How we do that is we make a list of evidences and compare the evidences to the explanations in the room. How can we explain what we're seeing in the room? So far, the only evidence we have is a dead guy laying face down. How do you explain dead guys laying face down? Well, he might have died by some natural cause. He might have accidentally died. He might have killed himself. He might have been killed by somebody else. These are the 4 ways that people die. The question is, which of these ways is most reasonable? And I know people are taking photographs. I'm going to send you this whole video. You're going to get it today. I'm going to send it to you today by text. So just relax. Don't take any pictures, okay? This is a 17-hour course I teach at Biola. There's no way I could do the whole thing here. So I'm just going to send you all the material, okay? Does that sound good? All right. So what do I do so far? I got a dead guy laying. Can I cross out any of these possible explanations given the evidence in the room so far? Not really. I mean, if he had a heart attack, he would look like that. If he accidentally took too many pills, he would look like this. If he intentionally took too many pills, he would look like this. If I poisoned him with too many pills, he would look like this. So far, everything is not only possible, it's all equally reasonable. Let's change our scenario. What if he's a dead guy laying face down, but he's in a pool of his own blood center torso? That would change things. Let's add that to our list. Can I cross out something now? What can I cross out? Yeah, I mean, look, is there some rare medical condition in which you could bleed from no opening in your center torso? Maybe possible, but I'm not after possible. I'm after reasonable. I can cross that one out. But until I roll him over, I can't cross out anything else. Let's change our scenario. What if he's a dead guy who's laying face down in a pool of his own blood, and now he's got a big honking knife sticking out of his back? Okay, why are you laughing at the knife in the back part? I don't know. By the way, this is my resurrection talk for Easter Sunday at churches, which is like a weird kind of a talk, right? Okay, so now we have to add this piece of evidence. Can I cross out something here? I think I can at least cross out. I mean, I don't know how you could accidentally get me. It's possible, but I'm going to go ahead and cross that accidental. But it is low enough that I could do this to myself. And we see a lot of crazy suicides because a lot of the suicides we investigate are drug-induced suicides. So I'm going to leave that last one in for now. Let's change the scenario, though. What if he's a dead guy laying face down in a pool of his own blood with multiple stab wounds, upper back? This changes things. And now I think we have to kind of at least, I think I can cross out suicide, unless you're just incredibly gifted, flexible, and have a high tolerance for pain. But for sure, if there was bloody footprints leading out of the room, you would know there's no way to explain that. So if I added that additional element, now we have a good reason to believe that this is a homicide. Are we all on the same page here so far? What we basically did was we compared the explanations to the evidences in the room. By the way, Jimmy is still alive, okay? He went to UCLA. I went to UCLA. We are both Bruins. Okay, my son David is a doctor. He went to USC. He's a communist. Okay, just so you know. That's the difference, basically, between those two things. Now, this process that we just talked about is a process known as abductive reasoning, and I drew it in the book so you can see it. This is from Cold Case Christianity. This process is a very common skill that detectives use, and we also asked jurors to employ this same process in jury deliberation. Now, why does this matter? Because when I was first looking at the case for Christianity, I knew that there was one piece of evidence that was more important than any other piece of evidence, according to Paul at least. It's this idea of the resurrection.
Now, it would seem that the resurrection of Jesus is the best explanation. We've crossed out all of the other possible explanations. So why are people still skeptical? Why aren't more New Testament scholars and historians jumping on board and claiming, along with the Christians, he is risen? Well, it has to do more, I think, with metaphysical preconceptions than it does evidence. And I'm not just talking about what I talked about in the first video about emotional and moral repulsiveness people have against Christianity. There are some metaphysical arguments against even the mere possibility of miracles that people give. So that's why they say, well, we have to just consider any natural explanation. We just can't go to the supernatural. And that's going to be the topic of the next video in this series.